to be here and very pleased as well, just to add to the global perspective we had, and really it was a global perspective, now the perspective from tiny Brussels and comparatively tiny Europe. The good part of the news is that the global terrorist threat and its implications for the European Union is a part of strong situational awareness in the European Union. And of course, I left now, as you know, INTCEN since 3 years, but I dare to say that INTCEN, due to the support of the EU member states, security services, is in a good position to inform member states governments and the EU institutions on, as Solana once upon a time said, all aspects of the terrorist threats to Europe and to European interests. And this structure, of course, not only INTCEN, which is comparatively small, but then the structures of the Commission and, of course, of member states, let's say home affairs ministries and law enforcement and police and security services capabilities are still in place. It is true that the terrorist threat in public awareness has sharply diminished, since public awareness, as all of us know, are only or is only in place when you have real big bangs or a sequence of smaller bangs, which really unsettles the complacency of societies which have other or different preoccupations. Nowadays, even more than before, in view of the socioeconomic ramifications of the war in Ukraine. If I have a look from Brussels, and as we have been doing that during all of my years over there, then we have, in fact, this kind of concentric view and look at the world outside first as the environment where quite a lot of terrorist threats start. We differentiate, of course, between the homegrown situation and then the external situation. But as we already heard, the external situation surrounding Europe in concentric circles is far more unsettled and far more unsettling as well than the present situation in Europe itself, which is only, let's say, it's not really good news, because if we look at the situation in Afghanistan, and if we look especially at the situation in North Africa, we have indeed large, not North Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, I should add, we have really large ungoverned spaces where you really can organize yourselves. What we just heard is from Ambassador Fitton-Brown is an somehow institutional look on the groups, on the militias, which are fighting, which are occupying parts of the respective territories, which are cooperating to a certain extent cross-border where the situation allows, and are constituting governed places, ungoverned places governed by themselves, creating safe havens for themselves, and of course, and this is then the major risk, safe havens for single or smaller subgroups of terrorists, which are not interested in fighting the respective local wars or regional wars, but are interested in preparing themselves to fight against the old enemy. That means the non-Muslim, the European, the imperialist, the Zionist, you can name them as well, either in their place. We should not forget that we had witnessed in the 90s and the 2000s very, very tragic terrorist attacks against Western presences in host countries. Tourists, I remember all the, let's say, bloodletting events we had in several touristic states, which then had become for a short while nearly terrorist states, due to the fact that so many lives had been lost due to attacks to hotels or Western interests, Western representations, and we should not overlook that risk, which is going to increase the lower the level of state control in the countries concerned will be. And of course, this bomb attack in Kabul, in front of the Russian embassy, is just a small reminder, what could happen, but not only in Afghanistan, of course, but nearly in all the countries mentioned by Ambassador Fitton-Brown, where terrorist militias, I would call them now, have gained a certain degree of resilience, of command and control over swaths of territory, and could decide, they haven't decided too often, with the exception, for example, of Somalia or Burkina Faso, just as spontaneous examples, to attack then not only state targets of their own state structure, but foreign presences. This is something which the European Union, which is as well obliged to care for citizens and representations abroad in the same way, are looking very, very hard to understand it and to prevent it in cooperation with capabilities in the countries concerned. And I say it in this neutral way because sometimes governments find difficulties, as we know, to really tackle these security challenges. And in addition to that, the European Union as well, very soon after the demise of the government in Kabul, already issued a EU Afghanistan Counter-Terrorism Action Plan, which is quite interesting to see. In September, as early as September 2021, that means weeks after the events in Kabul, the final events, just mentioning indirectly mentioning some of the weaknesses which are still there in place, protecting the European Union, especially the Schengen area, from the unchecked entry of dangerous people. Here, one of the major issues which will have to be improved is the capability to optimize systematic checks on biographical and biometric data of people coming from Afghanistan, not necessarily only Afghans, but let's say people coming from Afghanistan. We have now, as you know, a large migration move, not only from Afghanistan. And the major question is, who among all those who need support, who need help, who among of those might have second thoughts of their mission when they arrive to Europe? Not immediately after arrival, but then in due time. Here, I am not going now to enter into a discussion of all these steps. It's 24 action items the European Union just presented to member states, because we should not forget that most of the capabilities in place will have to be managed and put up and upgraded by member states. But I can only recommend to read that or take note of that, because it's a blueprint for the year or 2 or 3 years to come. With which European, I call it now, defenses against the terrorist threat should be upgraded and improved. If we now look to the threat inside Europe and to Europe from outside, very many things Ambassador Fitton-Brown already mentioned. So in that regard, I would just take 4 or 5 headlines, which we could later on, let's say, elaborate. We still have, of course, the problem of potential homegrown terrorism. It's quite clear. Homegrown terrorism, which is, of course, a major challenge due to the fact that you need to find the unknown unknowns. people who are self-radicalization, the lone actors, let's call it this way, many of them are lonely in their acts, but not necessarily lonely in the preparation, in the mental or in the self-radicalization preparation of the act. You know as well that one element of an increased self-radicalization is being considered as a result of the COVID-19, of the corona problematic, having people confined to their homes and to their PCs or their laptops. Here, due to the pressure, to the socio-economic pressure, the personal pressure, there is obviously, or has been an inclination to indulge in radical thoughts and attitudes, not necessarily connotated with Islamism, but as well with Islamism. And we are talking today on the Islamist terrorist threat and not, for example, about the right-wing terrorist threat, which has sometimes very similar potential and similar structures in its developing terrorist protective actors. So first of all, homegrown terrorism is still and remains a problem for most of the countries concerned in the European Union. We have the returning foreign terrorist fighters from prisons. Ambassador Fitton-Brown already mentioned. These are thousands as a potential, of course, not already running around and fooling around, but they need not to return directly to their countries of origin. If they do so, the risk for them of being detected, identified, arrested, and sued, if there is a legal basis, is not that low. Then they are going to join all those, again in their hundreds or low thousands, if we look at the whole European Union, of comrades who had already been arrested, sued, and imprisoned, and are now, from year to year, since these had not, most of these prison terms had not been long-term prison terms, are going to be released. The problem as well had been well understood, of course, in principle, since years. The issue is only finding solutions which work. That means a kind of de-radicalization attempts in prisons with very various results, to put it mildly. This is acknowledged, but does not remove the problem that you may have a substantial number. And if we are talking about a terrorist threat, you don't need hundreds to perpetrate an attack. You only need, let's say, one single actor or a small, very small group of actors. Remember all these major attacks we had in the 2014, 15, 16. These had not been dozens of people. And even 9/11 had not been, let's say, an attack which was perpetrated by hundreds of people. So the nuisance capacity nowadays with modern technology or even only bladed weapons is considerably high. So we have this as a second major risk and sometimes potential threat. That means returning foreign terrorist fighters from the prisons, for example, abroad, from these detention camps we have in Syria and in Iraq, as well as released convicted prisoners with a terrorist offense background. The next one is indeed that we will have to look into the new hotbeds, which are not anymore that new. Ambassador Fitton-Brown mentioned already in the Sahel zone, in the Horn of Africa, and of course in South Asia. You have now a situation where Western-supported governmental security pressure on networks, terrorist networks or terrorist militias over there, we should not overlook that most of them are militias and working as a militia in trying to gain ground and trying to topple a government, not necessarily indulging at that phase in international, transnational terrorism. But they are creating and have been creating safe havens for themselves and for people whom they consider as their friends and their allies. And we should not forget that, for example, the stability of the old Afghan veterans networks, and that means the Afghan veterans having fought in the 90s, up to the 90s, during the 90s in Afghanistan, from all walks of life and all countries, all Muslim countries in the wider Muslim world. They are still there. They have only become 10 to 15 or even 20 years older, who has not perished, who has not been imprisoned. Part of them as well, at least, are still over there. They have sometimes, look at the example of Libya, found their way into not state structures, but proto-state structures over there. Libya is one major conduit until this very day, due to its fractured nature, for people coming from the Sahel countries. I don't hint now at the migrants, but as people from terrorist networks, single ones, tiny groups, which could well make use of old, reanimated connections, good friends, just moving and trying to cross the Mediterranean the direct or indirect way or the other. Again, it won't probably big numbers to all likelihood, but it is a large milieu, a large transnational milieu, which is built on transnational mutual support. And this support, there are quite interesting studies about that, that of course affiliation to one group, whichsoever, does not mean to overrule the interpersonal networks you have. We should, in methodological terms, in terms of methods, we should have a look very closely to people who formed their interpersonal networks, even if they then ended up the ones in al-Qaeda or the others in Daesh or other groups, which on the one hand are fighting each other and killing each other, but on the other hand, just have a shared background, a shared ideology, a general ideology, and a shared sense of solidarity when it comes to go against a common enemy. And the common enemy is then not the rivaling group, but it is the third party. That means the infidels, whosoever you want to name them, or let's say countries against whom they have their personal grievances, which are then lifted to an ideological level. So this kind of perpetrators, small groups of potential perpetrators, moving in this, as the French would say, nébuleuse islamiste, transnational nébuleuse islamiste, this is still a persistent threat, and it is very difficult, that's the bad part of the news, very difficult to substantiate until it's too late. You need high resolution intelligence in a world which is not very open to Western eyes, as you can easily understand. I think we should just close with that general view. Happy to have additional questions for elaboration, but I think as a general threat picture, that means a global milieu which supports not only the respective militias, but the respective network of individual perpetrators. This is a feature which will accompany our present and future for a foreseeable time. Thank you very much.